Okay, good morning, Dr. Stone. How you doing?
All right.
So, what do we got today?
Well, we have an alphabet of evil.
An alphabet of evil.
And what I did was, I thought I could make one chapter of the new book I'm working on called The New Evil. It's like the evil since the 1960s when things changed a lot. I would go through my list of true crime books and different magazines and whatnot and pick out something choice and illustrative, from the A's, the B's, the C's, all the way down to A to Z.
Okay. So it's a highlight reel of all the alphabetical highlight reel.
Yeah. So I called it the alphabet of evil, picking out some choice cases.
So who do we have on first?
Well, the first one is Beverly Allitt, Allitt. She was born in England in '68, which is right the year that things really began to change in the culture. Mm-hmm. More drug use,
socially,
more narcissism, more sort of crimes that were very heinous, but also egocentric and brutal. Sometimes of a sort that were never recorded in the years before. She began to show signs of a peculiar behavior when she was an adolescent, especially in matters having to do with her health. In addition to become very overweight, she engaged in attention-seeking behaviors. For example, she would wear bandages that supposedly covered various cuts and wounds, but she didn't have the wounds. Or she would not allow anybody to probe what might be underneath them. On numerous occasions, she would end up in hospitals for one or another physical ailment that she complained of, though often enough the doctors couldn't find any physical abnormalities to substantiate her claims. She even hoodwinked the medical staff to perform an appendectomy on what turned out to be a normal appendix. Even so, she interfered with the healing of the surgical scars by picking at it.
Ooh. Ow.
On other occasions, she engaged in deliberate self-injurious behaviors, as is often the case with patients that get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. She would go from one doctor to another, with the result that many knew her superficially, but she gave no one particular doctor the full picture, the opportunity to know all her different ailments, many of which were fictitious or else grossly exaggerated. Collectively, the doctors gave her a fair amount of attention that she craved in what then amounted to a case of Baron-Munchausen syndrome, a factitious illness sometimes called specifically a feigned illness designed to elicit sympathetic attention from other people. She graduated, however, to a condition much more serious and much more malicious by then pretending to have appendicitis. She went on to nursing school, but failed to complete the program because of a new series of feigned illnesses, including a false pregnancy and weird behaviors like smearing feces on the wall of the nursing home.
Oh, good.
Always gets you a lot of attention. Even so, she was hired in '91 on a temporary contract by a hospital in Lincolnshire County, north of London, to work the night shift. It was not long after that a series of babies and young children became alarmingly ill, more so than the illness for which they had been admitted. And 4 of the young patients died shortly after admission from what seemed like respiratory crises or cardiac arrests. All these crises and deaths occurred within a few months of Allitt's coming on the night shift. There were other children who also suffered medical emergencies during the months on the unit, but who managed to survive. As all these cases occurred just when Allitt was the on-duty nurse, she was eventually suspected of foul play. Chemical assessments of the children, including the 4 dead children, reveal high levels of insulin in some cases, or else of lidocaine used to treat cardiac arrhythmias. Allitt was finally arrested and convicted of 4 murders and 9 other instances of deliberate life-threatening acts. For these, she was given 13 life sentences. Because her action was meant to draw attention and perhaps sympathy by inflicting illness on others rather than on herself, the condition is called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. First described in the 1970s, the syndrome, in over 90% of the cases, is set in motion by mothers or nurses. The syndrome itself is named improperly after a real German nobleman, Hieronymus Karl Friedrich Baron von Munchausen of Bodenweder.
Jesus, that's a long name.
A book of fantastical tales of adventures and was published, so-called Baron Munchausen's Narrative of Marvelous Travels and Campaigns in Russia, was published in England in 1785, allegedly written by the Baron, but actually composed by a former student of Göttingen University, whose name was Rudolf Erich Rossby. Rossby lived between 1737 and 94, had been introduced to the Baron and assumed, correctly as it turned out, that his little pamphlet of Gulliver-like tall tales would be more widely read and more profitable if ascribed to the famous Baron rather than to Rossby, who was really a nobody. The book was widely read and translated into many languages. It caused great embarrassment to the Baron, since people assumed he was really the author, rather than Rossby, a clever con artist who impersonated the Baron. All this was before the institution of copyright laws, of which, had they existed, Rossby would have been a serious offender. Because Alit was considered, besides a murderess of the most evil and appalling sort, a mentally ill person under Britain's Mental Health Act, she was and remains incarcerated in a forensic hospital, the Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottingham, northwest of London, where she will never be released. Even there, she has resorted to the original type of Munchausen syndrome by eating ground glass and pouring boiling water on her hand.
Wow. Just for the attention.
Yeah.
Just for the attention. How long was she actually a nurse before?
I think only a matter of some months.
Some months, right?
Yeah.
It didn't take too long before they caught on.
Some of them, some of the ones, I think I mentioned a few others in the A to Z.
Yeah.
Who killed more over a longer stretch of time by routes that were a little bit more clever and were able to keep doing what they were doing and not getting caught for a longer number of months or a year or two.
Yeah.
And killing much larger numbers of people. And there's even a doctor, Michael Swango, who from the States, who probably killed as many as 60. Sometimes you don't even really know how many because
you have to look back and dig through.
There was one guy recently who killed probably a couple hundred patients, but they were near death, so he would hasten it by injecting,
like a Kevorkian kind of.
And he did it really not even because of any one of these fancy Munchausen-like syndromes. He really wanted to knock off work. In other words, if he's on night duty and there's all these dying patients, what the hell?
Get it over with
he
quicker.
Would speed them on, maybe only hours before they would have died a natural death, but still, but it's still murder.
All right. So, would you like to move on from Miss Beverly and her Munchausen ways?
There's another A. I don't remember. Did we do China Arnold, the one that put the baby in the microwave?
No. You had mentioned that this morning when you came in.
Okay.
Got a nice shudder out of me.
Yes.
That's a good way to wake up in the morning. So what about Miss China?
Okay. Well, another murderess among the A's is China Arnold. When she was 25, 12 years ago, in 2005, she had been living with a fellow Terrell Talley, by whom she had the last of several children, a girl named Paris. Although he had been cheating on her, he worried that he may not have really been the real father of this baby girl. China worried that Terrell would leave her if he found out that he was not the father. DNA later confirmed that he was actually the father. But when he confessed to having had sex with a neighbor woman, China became furious. She then placed the 1-month-old Paris in a microwave and literally cooked the baby to death. She was arrested, tried, and convicted. The judge at the trial described her act as a heinous atrocity, which is not far from the truth. Yeah. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
What would compel someone, do you think, what would compel someone, you think, to do that? That's kind of a...
It's interesting that this happened already 12 years ago, but about 30 years ago, I had a colleague at Columbia in the psychiatry, Arthur Green, who began noticing in the emergency room there were a certain number of children or babies that looked as though they had been harmed by a parent because they had multiple fractures, the x-rays would show old wounds and new wounds, and he began to discover that they were really being harmed, mutilated, by
their parents.
By a parent. And often they were among very poor people and up from Harlem and so on. And he really and others around that time, put this whole idea of the battered children, it put it on the map among the conditions that one might see within the medical profession, because before that, it seemed inconceivable that a parent would inflict such horrible damages on a child. We know that parents have struck children, to make them obedient, going back probably to pre-biblical times. But when it reaches the proportions, where there's broken bones and gaping wounds and bleeding wounds,
blood, and it's a little
head
bit
injuries
much,
and things like that, then it passes a certain line.
Yes,
and so I think the people who work in the emergency rooms are much more alert to the possibilities when a kid comes in with, especially fractures and things that could be inflicted, as opposed to like a pneumonia or whatever.
An illness.
That there might be foul play involved.
That's crazy. I mean, I couldn't fathom sticking a 1-month-old in a microwave.
Yeah, but that's, the cruelty really passes. It's the sort of thing that if you were a novelist like Stephen King, writing about terrible things and hoping to sell your books, you wouldn't necessarily think even of that.
Exactly. He would be surprised by that.
These people come up with something that a novelist of dark stories wouldn't even cross his mind.
You couldn't even conjure up.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Or if he did, he would think it would disgust his readership, so that I'll
exactly.
I'll leave it
Tone
out.
it down a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. So who do we have next?
In the B's, there was the fellow Mark Barton, who was born in '55 and died just before the century's end, a spree killer from Georgia. And in July of '99, while in the process of losing a lot of money as a day trader in an Atlanta, Georgia brokerage firm, he shot and killed 9 people in 2 adjacent trading firms, I think one across the street from the other. These murders came in the aftermath of his having hammered to death his second wife and his 2 children as they lay in bed. Barton had already been the only suspect in the bludgeoning death of his first wife, Deborah Spivey Barton, and her mother, Eloise Spivey.
They were both bludgeoned by him?
The mother
and
mother-in-law
the first
were
wife.
both killed, as far as we know, by him as earlier. He'd been clever enough to eliminate evidence that might have led to his conviction. Shortly before the presumed murders, Mark had tried to take out $1 million insurance policy on Deborah, with himself, of course, as the beneficiary. The insurance company was a little suspicious, and they limited him to $600,000. And after his wife's death, the company was all the more suspicious and gave him only $250,000, placing the remainder in trust for the children. People said Mark was never the same after he took psychedelic drugs, during adolescence. The drugs gave him strange visions and visions of demons and so on, and he was hospitalized following a psychotic break. While at college, he learned to synthesize methamphetamines, some for himself and some for sale to other people. He was noted to be in personality paranoid, devious, quick-tempered, and malicious. The murders of his wife and mother-in-law, for which we assume he was guilty, were committed so he could be free to marry his mistress, Leanne Lang, whom he married soon after. Mark proved to be abusive and controlling toward Leanne as he had been before with Deborah. Obsessed with get-rich-quick schemes, he also got involved in the risky business of day trading in the stock market. At one point, he shot to death his daughter's kitten. A year later, Leanne she said she'd had enough, and she sued for divorce in July of '99. This was only a matter of hours before he embarked on the murder spree, the first victims being Leanne herself and the two children, Matthew and Michelle, from the first marriage. As the police closed in after the spree, Mark shot himself to death. The psychiatrist had earlier viewed him as a sadistic borderline or else an explosive psychopath. There had even been the intimation that he had sexually molested his daughter. So he was a person who was pretty bad, but made himself worse through the abuse of hallucinogenic drugs and so on. Spousal murder is, of course, not a new form of evil. There have been in the past few men who have killed two wives, like Richard Bennett and Carol Cole and Dr. Patrick Henry, Harold Henthorne, Eric Napolitano, Sergeant Drew Peterson, and Randolph Roth. All these men committed their wife murders within the past 50 years. And there have been women who killed two or more husbands, like Betty Lou Beets, Judy Buenoano, Jill Coet, and Belle Gunness. Of course, Belle Gunness goes back to the 19th century. And Sharon Harrelson and Virginia McGinnis. These women, prompted primarily by greed, killed their husbands for insurance money. With the exception of Bill Gunness, these women, their crimes took place in the last 50 years. Gunness achieved fame in the criminological domain for killing possibly dozens of husbands in the latter part of the 19th century. But Mark Barton's antisocial tendencies may have been intensified following his abuse of hallucinogenic and aggression-promoting drugs that were scarcely available in the pre-1960 period. LSD came into use, for example, in 1962 and imported from Switzerland. A few cases of methamphetamine abuse were recorded in the early 60s, but by 1964, its abuse had become quite common.
Therapy sessions, psycho-assisted.
Well, in 62...
It was different, but yeah.
In 62, I remember I was in training at Columbia in my psychiatric residency between 63 and 66. And one of my colleagues thought he might give it a try to see whether it would bring material up from the bottom, as it were, that might enlighten or contribute to his psychoanalytic treatment. And he took some LSD. There was a number of the psychiatric faculty and residents that took that. I declined to do that. I didn't like the idea.
Didn't want to get a shot?
At all.
Didn't want to try the Sandoz?
Yeah, and he had a very uncomfortable experience with it and so on. But there were people who were using it as if to free up, let's say, a person with obsessive personality, who really is very slow to come up with memories of uncomfortable or awful things that may have happened to him when he was younger. Because many men tend to be very sort of closed-mouthed and tight about
Keep
that
it
in
all
comparison to women.
Buried, yeah.
So the idea was give them some LSD and free up their thinking and get the psychoanalysis off the board. And I can't say as it worked any wonders at all. And there was also a time when you used to hear about someone putting LSD in somebody's tea at a party or whether, and the person would suddenly have all these horrible visions and
Experience,
experiences
yeah.
and jump out the window. So there were suicides that were occurring. It was a bad time. I remember people being admitted to the emergency room at Columbia who had taken LSD. One time, a guy had the hots for his mother-in-law. Most people hate their mothers-in-law.
Well,
But he had the
different
hots
strokes for
his
different
mother-in-law.
folks, I guess.
So after he got married, he put LSD in his mother-in-law's tea. And of course, she had what seemed like a schizophrenic break, and they admitted her to the emergency room at
Columbia.
New York Presbyterian up on 168th Street. And they gave her Thorazine or whatever one gave for a psychotic person at that time. And a couple of days later, however, she was all better. The stuff was out of her system. And then it came to light, that her son-in-law had
dosed
poisoned her
her.
with LSD. So there was a fake schizophrenia and a rather unwelcome addition to the family.
It's definitely
So we used to see that kind of stuff back then.
yeah. I've seen lately in news articles and stuff of it being used in smaller doses to help people with PTSD and other things nowadays.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had any take on that yet, or
Not really. Excuse me. But I mean, now the menu of drugs
it's changed over
is expanded tremendously. I mean,
Yeah.
bath salts, methylene dioxide, methamphetamine, all these different, or polyvalerone, all these different weird drugs that have hallucinogenic and other properties.
psychoactive
Very,
properties.
very dangerous. Not to mention the older ones like psilocybin from the mushrooms. I remember one time was working with a mother who had 3 sons, and she got a package one day in the mail from out west, but addressed to her son, and she was a little suspicious, so she opened it up, and there's a whole bag of mushrooms, and I never seen psilocybin, so, but I was talking to her on the phone, and I Googled psilocybin, and it showed a picture of a certain kind of mushroom, and I said, well, does it look like it has a certain stem and a little purple or whatever? And she said, yeah, that's what it is. So I said, so your son is importing shrooms.
Your son is doing drugs.
And so she threw it out and gave him a stern...
A stern talking to
a stern
on that
talking.
one.
At 18, he was too big to put over her knees and spank him. Well, in the case that I said, exhaustive vocabulary of adjectives that we use for acts of evil, such as heinous, depraved, atrocious, monstrous, unspeakable. There was a 41-year-old Utah man, Jared Baum, who murdered 2 teenagers and dumped their bodies 100 feet below the ground down an abandoned mine shaft. The families of 18-year-old Riley Powell and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Bray Lynn Otteson, reported them missing for some 3 months before their bodies had finally been found in the mine shaft near the Utah town with what I call the inappropriately, or I should say inadvertently appropriate name, Eureka, which is Greek for I found it. What had inflamed Baum's murderous impulses? Well, that's a question. It was in the morning of December 30th in 2017, and Baum had come home and saw his 34-year-old girlfriend, Morgan Henderson, chatting with a young couple. A morbidly jealous man, Baum had forbidden Morgan from inviting any male friend to their house. Apparently, the prohibition was in force even when the male friend was half Morgan's age and was accompanied with his girlfriend. Baum proceeded to immobilize the young pair, silence them with duct tape over their mouths, and placed them in the trunk of the boy's own Jeep. He then drove them, with Morgan by his side in the passenger seat, to the mine site. Once there, Baum forced the girl to witness the him beating the boyfriend and then stabbing him to death, before then killing her as well and tossing their bodies down the mine shaft. When their bodies were later discovered, it was noted that Baum had tied their hands behind their backs. Baum and Henderson soon became suspects because the police found messages on the boy's Facebook account that he had exchanged with Henderson. Questioned by the police, Henderson told various lies until she eventually, 2 months later, told the true story and led the police to the murder and the burial site. She then tried to hide the Jeep, driving it to a remote spot in hopes that it would not be found. Baum is now being held awaiting trial in the capital case, and the families of the murdered teenagers do not appear to be against the death penalty. Henderson is being held for obstruction of justice when she was, and the question is, was she reluctant to reveal the crime in case Baum would then kill her for informing the authorities? That's a question. And I suppose the answer is perhaps because she could have asked the police to put her in witness protection setting until the trial was over. At all events, his crime was one of the most sickening in recent times, adding the psychological torture to the physical torture, of which it can only be said that the torture was briefer and less methodical than that of David Parker Ray. But other than that, it's
Just
high up on the
as,
scale.
Yeah. Just as terrorists.
Natasha Wallen Cornett. She was born in 1979 and was a participant in a multiple murder of a young couple and their 6-year-old daughter, just 2 months after her 18th birthday. Natasha was born into harsh circumstances and with many disadvantages. Natasha's mother, Madonna, with an exalted name for a terrible woman, had been briefly married and soon divorced from a fellow named Ed Wallen. But the biological father was a policeman, Roger Burgess, with whom Madonna had been having an affair. Natasha grew up in poverty, raised by her mother, living in a trailer at the eastern edge of Kentucky near the town of Pikesville, right near the border to the next state, in West Virginia, in what had been called hillbilly country.
Sounds beautiful.
As described by another citizen of that blighted region, J.D. Vance, who had written a very moving and compassionate memoir called Hillbilly Elegy, which was published 2 years ago in 2016. On her 17th birthday, Natasha married Stephen Cornett, but was devastated when he ended the marriage only a few months later. So despite her full name, her mother's divorce and her own divorce meant that she was hardly ever a Wallen and hardly ever a Cornett. In mid-adolescence, Natasha suffered from anorexia nervosa and was also diagnosed with bipolar manic depression. Her behavior had been unconventional in a way that left her all but friendless when in school. She became part of the goth subculture, wearing black, listening to lugubrious music, abusing drugs and alcohol, and indulging in self-harm, all suggestive of her exhibiting borderline personality disorder, though that is not mentioned in the various accounts of her history. Natasha became the leader of some half-dozen similarly inclined adolescents whom she encouraged to join her by way of trying to escape their unhappy lives. In a journey to the promised land of New Orleans, that's where they were headed. But along the way, at a rest stop in Tennessee, they encountered a Jehovah's Witness family, a Norwegian immigrant, Vidar Lillelid, and his wife, Delphina, and their 2 small children, Tabitha, age 6, and Peter, age 2. Natasha and her troop stole Vidar's car and shot to death the couple and their daughter. Peter was seriously wounded but survived. There is some dispute as to who carried out the shooting, but all of them were quickly apprehended in Arizona before their plan after the murders to escape to Mexico. Natasha and 5 other Kentucky-born co-conspirators are all serving life sentences.
Was there any reason for the murder? Motive just for stealing
just to
the
get
car?
I think just to switch cars. And, you know.
It just went horribly wrong?
Yes, went horribly Natasha, in her early 20s, had become a Satan worshiper, presumably as an extension of her enthusiasm for the goth life during the late teens, though it is not lost on me that her name spelled backwards is Satan.
Oh, look at that. It is. Very interesting. Never thought of that.
I was looking up this goth culture in connection with another case yesterday, and I discovered that of course, it borrows from a number of sources, medieval,
Icelandic, Slovakian,
and the Romantic movement in the late 18th century, and the Gothic sculpture in the churches in the 10th,
Romanian,
11th, and 12th century. But also, the one that coined the term Gothic, in the sense of dark and
gave it
sad
its label,
was a woman, a singer, a young singer, who was born in '61 in England, whose name was Susan Ballion. But she spelled her name when she really became a very prominent star. It was kind of like Mariah Carey, whose every song was a hit, and and she was also able to keep changing her style to connect up with what was the current movement in the culture. She didn't keep doing the same thing over and over.
Yeah,
she
kept it current.
But she spelled her name Siouxsie, like the Sioux Indians. Susie, Sious. So she became Susie Sue.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But the spelling of the Indian tribe in South Dakota. So, so that was the origin of this. But there were a lot of young people in that era, in the late 60s, 70s, like the Columbine killers, Eric Harrison.
Every generation.
They were dressing in black and being like self-styled outcasts.
Yeah, social outcasts because they want to be.
Yeah. Or if they felt bullied and picked on, then they made themselves into this as if to become like a separate group of people who were feeling superior rather than demeaned by the larger culture. So I just found that out a couple of days ago about Susie Sue.
The fun fact for the day. All right, so where do we go from Satan?
Just a little bit more. So, as far as this Satan, Natasha, she had tried to be useful in prison, working for a time as a teacher's aide. A lead detective in the case, John Huffine, has expressed dismay that the case has garnered so much attention, since, as he put it, the troop represents the opposite of all the values in mainstream America holds valuable, including adherence to conventional religion. Mentioning good and evil, Huffine added that some people want to apply God and others the devil. The people often blame poverty as the root cause of future violent crimes. Certainly crime, including violent crime, occurs more often among the very poor than among the very rich. But there are many other poor who maintain stable marriages, are steady and diligent at work, espouse the best values of the religion in which they were raised. This enables a good many to escape the original poverty and to enable their children to become prosperous, to live, in effect, with what we are fond of calling the American dream. Natasha grew up in a poverty that was not only impoverished monetarily, but impoverished spiritually. There was no emotional stability, no parents staying together and helping the children, no anchoring in religion or any similar set of socially constructive values, and no medical help for the conditions that are generally quite treatable even in low-cost clinics, none of which did anything of any real help to Natasha. She was not a psychopath, destined to commit evil acts. She was pushed in the direction of evil by neglect, chaotic circumstances, rejection at school, and the same factor that conduces so many boys, though not so many girls, to end up with a criminal record, which is fatherlessness. A very important point.
Father figure in their life.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, on a side note, we can edit it out if you want to. What do you think about the YouTube shooter? The female who went into that YouTube headquarters 2 or 3 weeks ago?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of fizzled out and died, so we didn't really hear that too much about it after. Yeah.
I remember reading something about her.
Yeah.
I probably cut out the clippings, but I don't remember so much about her background. Do you know anything?
I didn't really know too much, but I didn't know if you had any insight on it, because I remember you'd mentioned mostly men are these mass shooters, and then poop, that one pops up.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting case, but I didn't know.
I remember her picture in the post and so on, but I don't think we knew a heck of a lot about her, actually.
Yeah.
Well, James Carson and his second wife, Susan Barnes, achieved notoriety in the 1980s for what became known as the witch killers. Drug abuse seemed to have played an even more prominent role than in the previous Cornett case, since the personalities of both him and Susan appeared to have undergone a transformation, for the worse naturally, once the drug habit was firmly in place. James had a young daughter, Jen, by his first wife. She became frightened of his changed, aggressive behavior. Taking her daughter with her, the two left James and moved from one place to another, fearing that he might find them and harm them. But he showed no interest in finding them, instead teaming up with Susan Barnes, whom he then married. They settled eventually in the Haight-Ashbury area of San Francisco, which had been the epicenter of the hippie culture, or rather the counterculture, as it embodied mind-altering drugs, opposition to the attitudes and traditions of the predominant culture, and adoption of mystical beliefs and alternate religions that most others found bizarre and even abhorrent. He changed his name to Michael Bear, but I include him here with the C's in deference to his birth name.
His surname.
Susan fancied herself a yogi with knowledge of the past, present, and the future. We can give her some credit for knowing about the past, but when you say you know about the future, it raises eyebrows. Both of them, adopting a different religion, styled themselves as vegetarian Muslim warriors who believed that witchcraft, abortion, and homosexuality were mortal sins, and that a higher power authorized them to kill persons guilty of any of those so-called transgressions. Their first victim was a young, aspiring actress, Karen Barnes, who had shared a room with them. Susan felt she had received orders from on high to kill the woman as though she were really a witch, bent on stealing Susan's yogic powers. They stabbed her to death, smashed her skull with a frying pan, for good measure, and then fled the area. That was in 1981. The next known victim, since it's believed they have killed many, was a farm hand on a Northern California marijuana farm. So their first victim was a young aspiring actress, Karen Barnes, who had shared a room with them. Susan felt she had received orders, as if from on high, to kill the woman as though she were really a witch, bent on stealing Susan's so-called yogic powers. They stabbed her to death and smashed her skull with a frying pan, for good measure, and then fled the area. That was in 1981. The next known victim, since it's believed that they've really killed many, was a farm hand on a Northern Carolina marijuana farm, Clark Stevens. James and Susan got it into their heads that Clark was a demon who had sexually abused Susan. They shot him twice in the head and burned his body, meantime leaving behind, as they fled, a manifesto in which they designated several famous people whom they regarded as deserving of assassination, such as Johnny Carson, President Reagan, and a number of others. Come 1983, and the couple were hitchhiking in Southern California. A John Hellier fellow, he picked him up in his car, and after a while they got into an argument, and Susan decided that John was a witch and should die. All three got out of the car, whereupon Susan began stabbing John, and James, Michael, shot the man to death in full view of many passing cars. Someone called the police, and the two were finally arrested. Each ultimately received sentences of 75 years to life, 25 years for each of the three known murders, although they are suspected of committing about a dozen other murders in the U.S. and even in Europe. Neither of them has shown a scintilla of remorse over the 32 years that they have thus far been in prison. The sister of Karen Barnes, the first victim, said, after hearing about the long sentences, that they are pure evil. And James, now grown, a daughter, Jennifer, spoke of the couple as heavy drug users who made their own moral and religious code, which she likened to a match meeting dynamite. We know nothing of their early backgrounds or whether they were already showed paranoid or all-consuming hatreds even before the heavy drug abuse. So it remains uncertain whether their murderously antisocial mindset pre-existed the abuse and was simply intensified by it, or whether the drug abuse somehow transformed them from their potentially peaceful citizens into murderous and deluded bigots. As for Susan's conviction that the Quran forbidding abortion, witchcraft, and homosexuality, only the latter is mentioned. I see nothing in any of my 4 copies of the Quran about witchcraft and nothing about abortion per se, only an injunction against killing one's children.
Interesting.
Wesley Allen Dodd, I think it's Wesley, but there might be a T in there, was born in 61 in Washington State near the Oregon border. The eldest of 3 boys, he grew up in a blue-collar family that was in turmoil during his early days. His father was domineering and harsh, arguing constantly with his wife over trivia. They divorced when Wesley was 15, by which time he had shown signs of serious sexual abnormalities for several years. He began abusing boys already when he was 13, would expose himself to neighbors when he was 14, and by 15, he would walk in the park naked and masturbate in public. He would search for boys of around 10 and expose himself, occasionally flashing girls as well. But he felt safer with boys because he felt that they were less likely to report him to the authorities. He had been arrested, nevertheless, at 15 for exhibitionism, but nothing was done except for the judge to recommend counseling, which is so common. When I hear these stories, you see the newspapers, like Larry Hogue, this fellow that used to molest and rape women to get off the bus, and when he was finally apprehended, the judge said, well, you need to be in psychotherapy, and as if there's any real treatment, for
that,
these people.
Yeah. Oh, I'm cured.
As
I'm
if
better
they could
now.
even afford treatment, if treatment would be effective, etc. So it's just something that judges are prone to say in situations of this sort without any real awareness that what they really need is the TAW key syndrome, which is throw away the key.
Yeah. There's no curing that, huh?
By 17, he would be molesting boys sexually, doing anal rape and bondage, although he managed to get 1 girl pregnant by whom he had a son, Ryan, who he never saw. Abuse of illicit drugs had become common during Dodd's early years. He himself never did drugs and never smoked or drank alcohol. At 19, he joined the Navy, but he was kicked out 2 years later for committing pedophilic acts with boys. When he was 28, he had moved to Vancouver, where he cornered 2 boys, one was 10 and the other 11, in the David Douglas Park there, a good area, he figured, to kidnap and rape and kill the young boys. Bill and Cole Neer, there were the 2 boys that he found there, and Dowd found both boys and tied their wrists together, and then he stabbed them to death. The younger boy, Billy, who was discovered bleeding severely by the police, but he died before he could tell them what happened. Dodd, meantime, concluded he got more thrill out of killing boys than out of raping them. Some months later, Dodd attacked again, this time a boy of 4, Lee Iselli, whom he raped and then murdered, and then dumping the garbage, as he called it, in a wooded spot near the Vancouver Lake. This time, Dodd was caught and arrested. As he revealed in letters he wrote while awaiting trial, he expressed an interest in eating a boy's genitals, keeping the castrated boys alive long enough to see Dodd cook and eat their genitals. Though he never carried out such an act, he felt that this was a more supreme act of torture than anything else he might devise. In this respect, his sadistic ambitions resembled those of Albert Fish in the 1920s and Albert Fentress in his rape, castration, cannibalism, and murder of Paul Masters in 1979. Fentress' act seemed so crazy at the time that he was diagnosed incorrectly, as it turned out, as schizophrenic, and he was remanded to a forensic hospital rather than being sent to prison. Fentress never acknowledged that he had committed the crime. To his credit, Dodd insisted not only in being punished, but in being executed for the sexual murder of the 3 boys. He demanded to be hanged rather than executed by some other means. Dodd wanted his execution to be carried out with no delays, warning the court that were he ever given the opportunity to escape or to kill someone within the prison, he would rape and kill and enjoy every minute of it. This put paid to the protests of the anti-death penalty crowd, and Dodd was duly hanged on the 5th of January in 1993.
Got his way.
The only other instance known to me of such candor and acceptance of blame by a serial killer was that of another gay serial killer, Carl Panzram, who snarled at the hangman for dilly-dallying with the rope. But that was 1930. Panzram's punishment was not for pedophilic crimes, but for raping and killing some 24 or more men. With respect to the postulate of cultural change and the new evil, the crimes of Wesley Dodd are not new, as if unheard of before 1960. There were men of either sexual orientation committing serial sexual homicide in the earlier years, such as Gordon Northcott in California, Albert Fish, Panzram, and Mudgett in the famous Chicago case where he was hanged in 1896. But their numbers pale by comparison with the much more numerous group of the post-1960 serial killers, and Dodd, who was killed in the 80s, belongs to the current group where broken families, drug abuse, and independent women were the rule rather than the exception. And the point about the independent women, since the pill became available in the mid-60s and the Roe v. Wade abortion rights in 1973, and women working after World War II, which goes back even earlier, a lot of women from, especially from working class families, who had husbands that battered them and forced them into submission, were now more free to leave a battering husband and say, the heck with this.
I'm going to start my own life.
And so they're going to live alone or find somebody else. And that, as far as I can tell, promoted a kind of backlash against these women, who these bitches,
independent women, yes,
who dared to be independent and leave,
their own lives,
their own life, and no longer be available for their husband's pleasure, and so that a small subgroup of these men, I think, turned to serial sexual homicide in much larger numbers than if you make a graph, as I have, of serial sexual homicide, starting, let's say, in the 1850s, you get 1 a decade, 2 a decade. It creeps up 3, maybe 3. By the time you hit the 60s, mid-60s, it goes up like the hockey curve, the hockey stick curve.
The stick curve, whoop, right up.
Right up, and to very high numbers in the late 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's trailed off maybe a little bit lately, but it's been much, much higher than in the preceding century.
It's crazy. It really is.
So, Joanna Dennehy, that's Dennehy, she was born in England in 82 and grew up in a working class home in Hertfordshire, southeast of London. She was raised in an intact family where neither she nor her sister suffered any verbal, physical, or sexual abuse and no neglect. She played with dolls when she was young, was a bright and athletic student, and did well on the flute. Her life began to spin out of control in her teens when she began to spend time with older students and to drink alcohol and smoke marijuana. She would skip school and get sexually involved with a young man of 20, 5 years older than she. Her parents disapproved. So at 16, she ran away from home for good, having reached an age when she could stay away legally in England at 16. Pregnant the following year, she gave birth to a daughter in 99. She found motherhood an inconvenience and an imposition on her freedom, shades of Casey Anthony in Florida. Under the influence of drugs, cocaine now added to the mix, she became temperamental and violent as well as promiscuous. The father of her daughter would not take her back And when she was 24, she had a second daughter. By now, she had become abusive toward the father, punching him, giving him a black eye, and hitting him with a racket. But she also began mutilating herself with knives and razor blades and put a metal stud in the middle of her tongue. She was now emerging as a woman with so-called borderline personality disorder, with the emphasis on inordinate anger, which is one of the signs. When she threatened the boyfriend or father with a knife, he finally left her, married another woman, and took care of the two daughters he had with Joanna. She now turned to prostitution by way of paying for her drug and alcohol habits, consuming as much as 2 quarts of vodka a day. That's a staggering amount, really. Joanna began living with another man, Kevin Lee, but had begun to lose her attractiveness and now developed a new addiction, violent pornography. She was hospitalized psychiatrically, which she considered antisocial, where she was considered antisocial, or else maybe psychopathic. A diagnosis of sadomasochism was added, since she seemed as fond of hurting herself as she was of hurting other people. After her release, her life took a turn for the worse. When she was 31, she stabbed 3 men to death, ostensibly just for the fun of it. Though she spoke of hating men, she took up with yet another man named Gary Richards, who was 7 feet 3, or 2 meters in height. With help from Gary and a third man, they dumped the bodies of her victims in ditches in remote areas. Meantime, she tried to stab the other 2 men to death. By this time, she was caught and arrested and no longer protected by her vicious dog, whom she named Hitler. Given a stiff sentence for the 3 murders, she was put in prison.
She had a dog named Hitler.
But in prison, she conceived a plan whose cleverness and deviousness elevated her to a unique spot among the ranks of the new evil, insofar as no similar attempts had been recorded in the past. Her plan was to escape from prison, but killing a guard and then cutting off his finger, with which she could then use to touch the security devices on the prison doors. The novelty and brilliance of her plan won her a certain grudging admiration from the authorities, but the judge scotched the plan, putting her in solitary confinement with no possibility of parole. Joanna felt the kind of sexual excitement from her acts of violence and murder that mirror the sexual sadism of men who experience sexual arousal when committing acts of serial sexual homicide. There are very few such women. England's Rose West was a wife of the serial killer Fred West, comes to mind, and maybe Florida's Eileen Wuornos.
Now, she's obviously still alive, incarcerated?
Yes, this woman is, yes.
So what do you think? I mean, is it hormones? Is it a certain event, traumatic event? What changes someone to go from having a pretty normal, like in this person's case, upbringing, intact family?
Well, you have to wonder about genetic predisposition to some condition. For instance, supposing she had, I don't know, like in the book that I read about her, whether there was mention of family members in the extended family with bipolar disorder.
Okay.
Because a lot of times you don't get very much information about the extended family. In other words, father, mother, but not about the uncles and aunts and cousins and grandparents. Now that I've been working with this other doctor, helping him write his medications, his patient load consists of a very large number of very ultra-Orthodox Jews and Hasidim from Brooklyn. And because that's a group of people, like a cult, that intermarry and don't ever marry outside.
Yep.
And if there's a grandparent with bipolar disorder, chances are there will be relatives in the parents level and the patient level who have. So it goes down the generations. So I always start every time I work with a new patient. I always take a very detailed genogram, going back as many generations as I can, and reaching out to all the uncles, aunts, cousins, and so on. as to whether there are here and there people with mood disorders or schizophrenic-like conditions. So if she had, let's say, some genetic predisposition to bipolar disorder, she wouldn't sound crazy the way people with a cognitive psychosis like schizophrenia, where they say peculiar things, and so, but she might have a tendency to strong disruptions of mood, and then if they abuse drugs, they can become much more severely ill, and including violent. So she may have had something like that in the mix, that contributed to her being such a deviant from the other people in the otherwise normal-looking family, as far as the smaller number of
tight-knit family.
Well, I didn't know anything about her extended family.
Yeah.
I only knew about.
Wow, great. Well, thank you for coming in, Dr. Stone.